Hello there, welcome to my review of the Rockford Files Season 4, Episode 18, South by Southeast. Written by Juanita Bartlett and directed by William Wyatt. The episode begins with Jim collecting his mail, once again receiving the mail of a neighbour, in with his own, before there's a knock at the door and he's approached by a federal agent who insists Jim go with him. Jim is then bumped from agent to agent trying to find out what's going on, eventually discovering that the feds are actually looking for Terence Halsey and mistake Jim for him. He's the man whose mail Jim has been getting by mistake. He's convinced to wait on a jet, having had a passport made up for him by the feds, which subsequently takes off and drops him in Mexico, nobody quite believing that he isn't Terence Halsey up until this point.
I'm not Terence Halsey.
You're on the passenger manifest.
It should be clear by now that the title of this episode, sounding like the Hitchcock film, is no coincidence. There's also a fun little joke about Jim missing an appointment at Northwestern Mutual.
Look, I have an appointment at Northwestern Mutual. It's an account I've been trying to get.
Now, I don't know whether it was intentional to have two mistaken identity episodes one after another in this season, but it would have been nice to have a little bit of breathing room between the two similar jumping off points. Having said that, already this episode has diverged so far from the previous that it's only really noticeable when watching them back to back. And unlike the previous episode, this takes a much slower pace setting everything up, as by this point Jim only knows he's been mistaken for Terence Halsey and that the mission the feds want him to do has something to do with socialite Christine Van Deerlin. Everything else is a mystery to him, and us, and all he wants to do is get back home as quickly as possible, which is unlikely. Here the events are dictating the action and Jim is caught in the wake. And it does have a very Hitchcockian feel in that respect, the average man being thrown into a dangerous adventure with no clue what's happening to him, or why. But in this case, Jim is a far more experienced protagonist than Cary Grant's Roger Thornhill or Robert Donat's Richard Hannay. However, his inability to speak Spanish does leave him clueless when he's collected by his Mexican handlers, until finally he's taken to someone who knows he's not Halsey.
You're not Terence Halsey.
And he can explain just how incompetent the feds have been, sending the wrong guy to a foreign country, only to be told they need him to remain there and help them complete the mission, to discover the reason for Van Deerlin's unusual behaviour of late.
Christine sold 50,000 shares of Bel Air aircraft to an Arab country.
Jim has no choice but to agree and introduces himself to Van Deerlin, explaining what he knows before a gunfight breaks out and the two have to flee. Thankfully not pursued by a crop sprayer. As the two make their way, somewhere, they have a conversation entirely irrelevant to the plot, but that does so much to develop their relationship that it's essential.
You know, since you're the reason I'm here, do you think you could work on being a little less rotten?
She's initially antagonistic towards him because she thinks he's an agent just intent on completing his mission, and he blames her for him being there. But as they discover the truth, a rapport develops between them, and this quickly means their antagonism towards each other gives way to a mutual respect.
I'll work on it.
It's also beautifully underwritten, so that it never feels trite or contrived, just two people thrown together in difficult circumstances behaving like real people. It quickly becomes clear that neither of them are where they want to be, him physically and her mentally and emotionally, and this is one of the things that they're able to bond over. Although when he gets a little too close to the truth, she backs off.
Christine, you're afraid of him.
Don't be ridiculous.
All of this bonding comes to an end when Jim is arrested for kidnapping her. Thankfully, she's able to back up his story and he's released, only to be collected by his Mexican handlers again. This time, though, he's given his passport and a ticket home. But having seen how Van Deerlin's husband treats her, he's not quite ready to leave. Conning his way into the Van Deerling's wedding anniversary, he meets with Christine, and suspects she's being poisoned by her husband. When she confesses her husband is blackmailing her over her father's unfounded legacy. He manages to rescue her, and they part on bittersweet terms. There's a simplicity to this episode, hidden behind layers of intrigue and spycraft, that displays a level of writing far beyond that of similar shows of the era. The mistaken identity issue is just the catalyst to get Jim involved, and the feds wanting to know the reason for Van Deerling's business dealings is largely superfluous. Then, just when we think it's really about rescuing this poor woman from her dangerous husband, it's actually a hidden, subtle love story about two people from two different worlds who can't be together. The two most important scenes illustrating this are of Jim and Christine getting to know each other as they make their way back to civilization, and the scene where they part, returning to their very different lives, with her having been rescued from her gilded cage. Normally, we might expect to see the two at loggerheads for much longer before they fall in love, thrown together into difficult and dangerous circumstances before the truth is revealed. But what this episode proves is that with a deft enough script, you don't need the extremes to be so pronounced, nor do you need the fairy tale ending, when a much more realistic one serves the plot better. While you could argue that the reason they part is because the show needs Jim to remain single to return to some sort of equilibrium for the next episode. But I don't think it's as cynical as that here. I think it's a more honest ending about what happens when two people meet in such circumstances. While a movie might end with these disparate people as a couple, in reality it probably wouldn't work out, and so that's what Bartlett gives us with this script. What would really happen once the fairy tale ends and reality kicks in. The socialite born into wealth and high society would be no happier in Jim's trailer than Jim would having to attend these sorts of public events and live in a mansion. As I've discussed before, he lives in a trailer because that's the life he chooses, the job he chooses, and the lifestyle he chooses. Sure, he'd like to get paid more, or more often, but for doing the same job. This is an incredibly layered script with mountains of pathos that ultimately delivers the right conclusion. And while it might not be in many people's favourite lists, it's easily a 5 out of 5 for me. Thank you. Goodbye.